What's the #1 coolest, most amazing feature in InDesign? Well, XML, of course. No, I'm just kidding. It's transparency. And we've already seen how InDesign can import images with transparency. Now let's take a step farther and look at how you can apply transparency effects to any object in InDesign. I have my magazine document open from my exercise files folder, and I'd like to apply an interesting transparency effect to this graphic over here. So I'll select it and then zoom in to 200% by pressing Command 2 on the Mac or Control 2 on Windows. Now I'm going to open the Command Central for all transparency effects, and that's the Effects panel. So I'll go up to the Window menu and choose Effects. Let's go ahead and move this out of the way a little bit so I can see what I'm doing. Now you can apply a transparency effect to any object on your page, whether it's a graphic frame, a text frame, a line, or whatever. And the first thing we're going to do here is change the opacity of this graphic. And I'm going to do that right here in the upper right corner of the Effects panel. Right now it's set to 100%, so that's zero transparency. You cannot see through this at all. But if I type 50% inside this field and then hit Return or Enter, well, now it's 50% opaque and 50% transparent. I can also use this little pop-up menu on the right to get a slider to make it more or less opaque. Now, the second transparency effect you can apply here is the blending mode. That's this pop-up menu over here. Right now, the blending mode is set to normal, but you can see that we have a lot of different options here. Almost all the options from Photoshop and Illustrator show up here. So, for example, we could change this to multiply. Multiply kind of burns the effect in, like a shadow. Or I could choose screen. Screen is just the opposite of multiply. It's kind of like shining a light on a screen. Multiply always makes the effect darker, screen always makes it lighter. All right, that's looking pretty good. Now I'm going to zoom back to fit the spread in the window by pressing Command-Option-0 or Control-Alt-0. And I'm going to pay attention to this caption down here. So I'll select it and then zoom in to 200% again. This white frame with the black text in it looks pretty good, but I'd like to see through the white just a little bit. Now, I could select this frame and then come up here to the Effects panel and change the opacity to, say, 70%. But the problem with this is that it makes the entire object 70% opaque. That is, I can see through the white, but I can also see through the text. The text is kind of gray now, and I don't want to do that, so I'm going to set this back to 100%. Instead, what I want to do is change the opacity of the background fill, but not the text. And fortunately, the Effects panel lets me do that. It all has to do with what's selected in this list inside the panel. Right now, Object is selected. And that means the opacity and blending modes are going to be applied to the entire object. But in this case, I'm going to choose Fill. Now any change I make to the Effects panel will only affect the fill of this object. So again, I'll come up here and change this to 70%. And now it's made the white background fill 70%, but the black is now solid. By the way, I should point out that you don't have to open the Effects panel to do all of these things. Even if the Effects panel were closed, you can still get to many of these effects up here in the Control panel. That's this area over here. For example, this pop-up menu here lets me choose what part of the object I want to change. You can see right now it's set to Fill. And down here is the opacity. Now, InDesign has a bunch of other transparency features too, like drop shadows. Everybody loves drop shadows because they give a sense of depth to a page. They make things pop. So let's see how you can make a drop shadow in InDesign. I'm going to zoom back to fit the page in the window with Command-0 or Control-0 on Windows, and I'm going to select this image up here. Let's zoom in on this, Command-2. This is a Photoshop image that had a transparent background in Photoshop, and I've placed it inside InDesign, and you can see right through the background. Now I'd like to give this a drop shadow. So to do that, I'm going to come up to the Control panel and click on this little icon. The problem is, when you do it this way, you almost always get a too big, kind of clunky, yucky shadow. So I don't like to do that. I want to have more control over my drop shadows, more options. So instead, I'm going to hold down the Option or Alt key when I click on this button. When I do that, up comes the Effects panel. And this gives me a lot of control over exactly where the drop shadow will sit and how it looks. I better move this out of the way a little bit so I can see what I'm doing. And now I can change the color, the opacity. Let me bring this down a little bit, maybe 60% instead. Then I'll press the Tab key to jump to the distance field. This is the position, how far away it is from the image. I'm going to make this smaller, maybe 4 points. Then I'll hit the Tab key and I'll just tab through all the fields in here down to the size. Maybe I'll make this a little bit smaller as well, maybe 4 points as well. Now let's go back and make it larger. I'll blur it out a little bit more by making it 8 points. There we go. That makes it a little bit more subtle. And the last thing I'm going to do is change the noise down here. I always like adding just a little bit of noise, just 3 or 4%. You don't need very much, but it makes it significantly more natural looking. Now I'll click OK and see my drop shadow behind my image. I know there's a transparency effect applied to this image, not just because I can see it on screen, but also because I'm looking at the effects panel. And look up here. I can see this little effects icon there. That effects icon means there's a transparency effect applied to this, and if I double-click on it, it takes me back to the effects dialog box. I'll just click OK here because I want to apply a different transparency effect to this text frame down here. I'll select it and then zoom back just a little bit by pressing Command- or Control- on Windows. Now you probably noticed there were a bunch of other effects in that dialog box, right? And I can get to all of those other effects with this pop-up menu to the right of the drop shadow button. There we go, the little effects pop-up menu. Or if I have the effects panel open, which I do down here, I get exactly the same pop-up menu down here at the bottom. There's the effects pop-up menu as well. In this case, I'll choose Outer Glow. That's kind of cool, gives it kind of an ethereal look. Now I can also go in here and change each of these effects with the various controls. For example, if I click this little swatch here, I can change this from the paper color to a darker color, maybe this dark blue color, and click OK. And I'll change the blending mode from Screen to Multiply. Now as long as the effects dialog box is open, I can apply more than one effect at the same time. For example, I'll come over here and click on Bevel and Emboss. That makes it kind of a 3D effect, although this size is way too large. Let's bring this down to 3 points. You should just go crazy in here and try things out. It's fun. Now, of course, I'm not saying this is attractive or even great design. I'm just saying you can do it. Hopefully you have a better design sense than I do. Oh, one more thing. Remember how I said you can apply a transparency effect to any object, whether it's a text frame, graphics, lines, anything like that? But you cannot apply transparency to individual bits of text, like one word inside of a text frame. Just the whole object, the whole frame itself, and all the text inside of it. Actually, come to think of it, if you do need to apply an effect to one word, I'll show you a workaround for how to do that later on in this chapter. Also, and this is an important one, how do you delete the transparency effect after you've made it? I could simply turn off those checkboxes, or if the dialog box is not open, I could drag this little effects icon down into the trash can. Or I'll go to the effects panel menu and choose Clear All Transparency. There we go. Now all the transparency effects are gone. Obviously, the options for cool effects in InDesign are endless. In fact, if you want to see amazing effects that anyone can learn how to do in InDesign, check out Mike Rankin's title called InDesign Effects here in the online training library.